Rhea Blackbird was caught in a trap deep in the wild, just as the sound of a man's boots crunched closer through the cold silence of the pines. Before we kick off this adventure, don't forget to hit like on the video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The valley held its breath. Only the wind moved, snapping brittle pine limbs, whispering over frozen creek beds, carrying the faint scent of ice and iron. Boots pressed into thin snow atop hard dirt as Elias Whitaker made his way down the same narrow trail he'd walked daily since the first freeze. His trap pole rested across one shoulder, eyes trained ahead. This was routine. Check his lines, bring back what was caught. Fix what was broken. Waste nothing. Elias was 32, but time had carved more into him than the years could account for. His hair was dark and cut close stubble rough along his jaw. The worn coat he wore was patched over more than once. A scar trailed down his right thigh, a war wound he never talked about, but one that still dictated how he moved strong plant with the left, a drag of the right to follow. He'd lived alone in that weather-bitten cabin for 3 years, ever since fever stole Jesse, his younger brother, his last kin. Out here, it was all survival. Keep warm, keep fed, keep breathing. That afternoon, as he turned the bend where the creek split the ridge, he heard something new. A cry. Sharp. Human. His body stiffened instantly, both hands tightening around the pole until the grain bit into his palms. The second cry came weaker but unmistakable. A woman. He surged forward, crashing through brush and snow despite the weight on his shoulder and the pain in his leg. His boots kicked up powder branches, clawed at his coat. Then he broke through into the clearing and saw her. She lay curled on her side, one leg clamped in a steel trap made for wolves. The iron jaws had torn through hide and into flesh. Blood had soaked through the shredded deerskin wrapped at her shin, melting the snow beneath her. Her hands, ghost pale and shaking, scrabbled at the trap's jaws, but she was too weak now. Long black hair tangled across her face, strands stuck to her cheeks with cold sweat. Her dress was torn at the collar, revealing bruises and a chest hollowed by hunger. She looked proud and shattered. Her jaw was clenched with fury, but her limbs had nothing left to give. Elias felt his gut twist. He'd seen plenty of animals caught in metal, but never a person, and certainly never an Apache woman. That alone would have sent most men walking the other way, but Elias wasn't most men, not anymore. He'd seen too many bodies rotting in open fields, too many eyes go dim with no one to care. He dropped the pole, fell to one knee, and gripped the trap with both hands. The spring resisted, biting deeper before it gave way. She gasped as the jaws released her body, jerking before she collapsed back into the snow. He tossed the trap aside and studied the wound, deep but survivable if cleaned. He didn't speak. There wasn't room for words here. He simply slid one arm under her shoulders, the other beneath her knees, and lifted. She was far too light bones sharp through skin. A broken sound escaped her lips, part pain, part relief, and her head slumped against his chest. Elias looked back once at the trap still gaping in blood-stained snow, then turned toward the cabin. The way back was long. Every step up the slope sent pain howling through his leg, but he held her tight and walked steady. She'd never survive the night alone. That was reason enough. The cabin finally appeared roof-heavy with snow hunched against the hill like it was bracing for another blow. Smoke still coiled from the chimney where he'd left the fire alive. He shifted her weight, nudged the door open with his shoulder, and stepped inside. Heat washed over them, wood smoke and pine, thick and earthy. He carried her straight to the narrow bed in the corner. The quilt was old but clean, laid there from habit, not hope. He eased her down, careful not to jar the leg. She hissed through clenched teeth, but kept her eyes on him sharp even now. Elias stood over her for a beat, breathing hard, sweat cooling down his neck. He hadn't let a soul cross this threshold in years, not since Jesse, not since he chose silence over sorrow. But leaving her out there hadn't been an option. Not for him. He peeled off his coat, tossed it over the chair, rolled up his sleeves, and reached for the kettle. Water needed boiling. That leg needed stitching. He'd done worse on darker nights in worse places. He could do this. Finally, he looked at her. His voice came low and sure. "You're safe now." For a moment, her eyes softened. Then they closed, and her body surrendered to the warmth she likely never expected to find. Elias stood still, feeling the weight of what he'd just done settle deep into his bones. Steam hissed from the kettle, curling against the rafters. He reached up, pulled down a small tin box from the shelf. A soldier's kit needles, coarse thread rags from an old shirt, carbolic soap, a stub of whiskey. He always figured they were for him, if the leg ever tore again. But now they were for her. She breathed shallow but steady on the bed. Her eyes flickered open when he pulled the chair close. She didn't look afraid, just wary the way someone gets after too many bad hands. Her lips parted once as if to speak, but she swallowed it down and looked away. Elias took his knife, slid it through the leather of her boot, careful not to tug at the injury. The trap had dug deep flesh muscle, everything. He wondered if he had enough clean cloth, enough will. His hands trembled. He clenched his jaw. And he got to work. He couldn't let her bleed out. He'd stitched men up in darker places under worse odds. He poured the steaming water over the gash, watching the blood and dirt swirl away like red smoke. She gasped, her hand seizing a handful of quilt, but not a sound escaped her throat. "You'll need stitches," Elias said, voice flat but steady. "It'll hurt, but it'll hold." Her eyes flicked up to him, dark, intense, unflinching. Then a small nod. Barely there, but enough. He splashed whiskey on the wound. She jerked, teeth clenched, and for one sharp second her hand shot out, gripping his wrist with a strength that surprised him. He didn't pull away. He let her hold on until the pain passed and her fingers loosened. Then he threaded the needle and began the work. His hands weren't gentle, but they were sure. The stitches weren't pretty, but they were solid, precise, the way a soldier learns. Sweat beaded at his brow as he worked. By the time he tied off the last knot and cut the thread, her face had turned pale, her skin damp with cold sweat. But her eyes, those eyes were still locked on him. Once done, he wrapped her leg with clean strips of linen. He rinsed off in the basin, then sat back, breath ragged, chest heavy. And he realized he was staring not at the bruises, not at the torn dress, but at her resolve. She had taken all of it in silence. "What's your name?" he asked at last. Her voice was raw, low, rasping. "Rhea." He nodded once. "Elias Whitaker." He offered nothing more. He rarely did. She let his name settle in the space between them, then closed her eyes. Her body sagged under the weight of it all. He pulled the quilt higher over her shoulders, tucking it in snug. Then turned back toward the stove. Smoke and whiskey lingered in the air, sharp, warm, alive. He filled a dented tin cup with black coffee and set it on the small table beside her, just in case she woke thirsty. Thoughts pressed in questions he hadn't asked. Where she came from. Why she'd been alone. Who had left her to bleed in the valley. But he left them quiet. He knew the taste of silence. He remembered how often folks had poked at his own scars, and how many times he had shut them down. Some wounds weren't for talking about. Still, the question sat heavy in his chest. Was she running from something? Was someone hunting her? Would that danger find its way here? He glanced at the rifle above the door. At the lock. He'd made a choice today, maybe without even knowing it. Whatever was after her was now coming through his door, too. He stayed up late, long past the hour he usually let the fire die down, feeding the stove, listening to her breathing. She slept, but he didn't. His body was bone-tired, but his mind stayed sharp, playing over the sound of her cry at the creek, the tremble in her grip. He knew then he couldn't send her back out there, couldn't point to the door when morning came, couldn't pretend this hadn't happened. Whatever lay ahead, she was here now. And the cabin wasn't his alone anymore. When first light crept gray across the shutters, Elias poured water over the coals and stepped to the foot of the bed. She still slept, dark hair fanned across the pillow, chest rising and falling, slow and steady. For the first time in 3 years, the silence in the cabin didn't feel like the silence of being alone. It felt like something waiting to change. Soft morning light slipped through the cracks in the shutters, casting gray lines along the log walls. The stove had burned low, barely enough to hold off the chill. Elias was already moving slow on his bad leg, stoking embers, setting a pot of beans and venison scraps to cook. He hadn't slept much, but he didn't feel it. Routine kept him upright. Routine had carried him through worse. He turned when he heard her shift. She blinked at the light, slow at first, then sharper as memory returned. Her hand reached for the bandage on her leg. She touched it gently, then met his gaze. "You stitched it," she said, her voice rough. "I did," he replied. "It'll hold if you keep it clean." She pushed herself up on her elbows, breathing harder with the effort. He saw the look in her eyes, not fear of the wound, but uncertainty about him. A stranger's bed, a torn dress, no defenses left. He knew that look. He'd worn it himself once. He moved to the stove, poured coffee into the same tin cup and carried it over. Set it on the table beside her. Strong. No sugar. Best I got. She stared at it a long beat, then took it. Her fingers trembled around the metal, but she brought it to her lips and drank. The heat made her cough, but she didn't set it down. Hunger flickered behind her eyes, hunger stronger than pain. "I'll get you food," he said, already turning back to the pot. He scooped out beans and meat, placed it in a bowl, and handed it over with a spoon before stepping back. She hesitated, watching him, measuring. Then she pulled the bowl close and ate in slow, careful bites. Elias leaned against the table, arms folded, watching without watching. He didn't speak, just let her eat. But his thoughts kept circling. Who had hurt her? Where had she come from? Was anyone following? Only the scrape of her spoon against the tin filled the silence. Finally, when the bowl was halfway empty, he asked, "You from a camp nearby?" Her eyes met his, dark, wary. Not anymore. She didn't say more. He didn't ask. Some answers had weight you had to carry on your own. He knew what that felt like. He thought of the neighbors in town who once tried to pull his story out of him, asking questions with soft voices and pity in their eyes. He hated it. He wouldn't do that to her. She'd speak when she was ready. Or she wouldn't. And that'd be fine too. Instead of prying deeper, Elias asked what mattered most. "Were you traveling with anyone?" Her jaw tensed. No. She looked down at the bowl again. Her face stayed still, unreadable, but the way her hand clenched around the spoon said more than words. Elias nodded, letting it be. Whatever had happened, she was on her own now. That was all he needed to know for now. When she'd finished eating, he took the bowl and rinsed it in the basin. He felt her eyes on him the whole time, watching the way he moved as if trying to figure out the kind of man he was from action alone. He didn't mind. Truth be told, he believed in that more than words, anyway. Her gaze drifted toward the rifle hanging above the door. Her body stiffened just a little. Elias noticed. Without thinking, he said calmly, "It stays there. Won't use it unless there's reason." She gave the smallest nod, and he saw her shoulders ease a little. By midday, he checked her wound again. She didn't resist, just watched him quietly as he unwrapped the bandage, looked over the stitches and rubbed on the same salve Doc Virgil once gave him for his own busted leg. Her skin flinched under his fingers, but her eyes never left his face, searching, studying, looking for something steady or dangerous in his expression. All she found was focus. The kind of quiet care that didn't ask for thanks. "You'll walk again," Elias told her as he wrapped the leg back up, snug and firm. "But not yet. Push too soon, you'll rip it open." The silence that followed was thick, but not like before. It wasn't laced with doubt or guarded fear. It was the kind of silence that gave room. Room to breathe, to think. To begin to figure out what this strange new ground between them meant. As the light outside dimmed and the wind picked up with a sharper bite, Elias tossed another log onto the fire and moved his chair closer to the table. He kept his hands working, mending a busted leather strap from one of his traps, but his thoughts wandered. The cabin felt different now, not as hollow, like a door had creaked open inside him and someone had stepped through before he even knew it was there. Rhea lay watching the fire, her body worn down, but her mind awake. For the first time, she spoke without that armor in her voice. "Why are you alone?" The question slid through the room like a blade. He didn't look up from the strap. "Lost my family," he said, in the same plain way he said most things. Easier not to talk. She didn't say anything right away. Just watched the flames, her expression soft with something that wasn't pity, but wasn't far off either. Understanding, maybe. Or something close enough to feel like it. That night, as the fire crackled steady, she drifted off into sleep again. Elias stayed up longer, listening to the wind claw at the shutters, that question haunting him. What if someone was still looking for her? What if trouble came knocking? But when he turned his head and saw her curled under the quilt face, softer than it had been since the moment he found her, he knew he wouldn't change a thing. He'd made his choice. The storm rolled in hard by late afternoon. Snow slammed against the windows, the roof groaned under the weight of the wind. The cabin stood its ground, but the sound pressed in like a threat, a steady reminder that the world outside didn't offer warmth or mercy. Inside, the iron belly of the stove glowed bright, casting flickering light across the room. Elias checked the woodpile by the door. Enough for 2 more days, barely, if the weather stayed mean. He'd need to split more soon. Even if every swing sent pain screaming through his thigh. Rhea was awake, sitting propped up with the quilt pulled high around her shoulders. The bruises across her chest had started to fade, but the bandage on her leg still needed changing. She looked better, more color in her cheeks, more strength in her spine. She'd finished a bowl of stew earlier, just dried beans, a scrap of venison, and the last onion from the root cellar, but Elias saw the pain in her still in how she caught her breath when she shifted too fast. He set another pot of water on to boil. "I need to change that bandage," he told her. Her eyes flicked to him, cautious, but she didn't argue. He pulled the chair close, washed his hands in the steaming water, and gently unwound the cloth. The wound was raw but clean. His stitches were holding. He dabbed on more salve, his fingers steady. She winced once, then caught him off guard. "You served," she said. It wasn't a question. It was a fact spoken aloud. He looked up, met her gaze for half a second, then turned back to the wrapping. "Yeah," he answered. She kept watching him. "That's where you learned all this?" He gave a small nod. He thought about telling her more about blood-soaked fields and long nights filled with screams, but the words caught in his throat and stayed there. The silence between them was easier. She didn't push, just reached for the cup of water he'd left by the bed. Her hand trembled, and water sloshed over the side. Without thinking, Elias reached out and steadied her wrist, helped guide the tin to her lips. She drank slow and quiet, then set the cup down and looked at his hand still resting over hers. Neither of them moved. Then he eased back, letting go, placing the cup back on the table. Outside, the wind howled louder, rattling the shutters hard enough to shake the walls. "It sounds like it wants to tear this place apart," she said softly. "It won't," he said, his voice calm. "Built it myself. Holds better than it looks." That brought the faintest smile to her face, just a small tug at the corner of her mouth. But it was the first sign of softness he'd seen from her yet. And he felt it settle in his chest like a spark of something more. It didn't last long, but it stuck with him. Later that night, with the wind howling like a freight train in the distance, she made an effort to help. When Elias set a pot of beans to soak for the next day, she insisted on stirring. Her hands moved slow and shaky, but there was grit behind every motion. Elias handed her the spoon without a word. It was awkward, her propped up in bed, trying not to spill, but she didn't stop. He understood what it meant. She didn't want to be dead weight. "You don't have to," he said gently. "I know," she replied. "But I will." The tone in her voice didn't leave room for argument, and he respected that. When night settled in deep, he poured a bit of whiskey into hot water and handed it to her in a tin cup. "Helps with the pain," he said. She took it, sipped slow, letting the warmth settle through her. He sank into his chair by the stove, eyes locked on the flames. She stared at him for a long while before speaking again. "Why'd you stop when you heard me?" she asked. Most men wouldn't. He thought on that. Thought about how it hadn't felt like a decision, not really. More like something he couldn't not do. "Because I couldn't walk past," he said finally. She didn't answer, but her eyes lingered on him unreadable. Something shifted between them, then something small, but real. A spark of trust, fragile as spider silk, but there. Later, when the night was bone-deep dark and the pain came back strong, she clenched her jaw, breathing heavy. Elias reached across the quilt, rested his hand beside her knee without pressure. She hesitated, then slid her hand over his. The storm outside tore through the valley wind, clawing at the cabin walls, but inside, the quiet was enough. No words, no promises, just a touch that stayed. Before sleep took her, she whispered, "You'll keep me here, till I can walk." "Yes," he said simply. "You're safe." Her eyes slipped shut, her hand still resting over his. And for the first time since he'd carried her out of the snow, Elias realized the cabin wasn't just shelter anymore. It was starting to feel like something shared. By dawn, the storm had passed. The whole valley was buried in white. The air was sharp enough to cut breath from your chest. The cabin roof groaned under the weight, but it held just like he said it would. Smoke curled steady into the brittle blue sky. Elias threw on his coat and gloves. His leg throbbed from the cold, but the woodpile was low and the drifts were crawling up the walls. If he didn't clear it soon, they'd be snowed in. Rhea was awake when he turned from the door. She'd propped herself up, quilt around her shoulders, watching him. Her eyes were clearer now, color returning to her cheeks. "You shouldn't be on that leg too long," she said, nodding toward his limp. He paused, hand on the latch. It surprised him that she noticed. Most folks never did or acted like they didn't. But her eyes missed nothing. "It'll hold," he answered plainly. Then added, "I'll be careful." That seemed to ease her a bit. She nodded, and he stepped out into the cold. The wind bit hard. Every breath came out white. He cleared the path first, then started chopping wood. Each swing slower than it once was, but clean. Steady. He didn't stop until the burn in his thigh forced him to. When he turned back, he saw her at the window face, pale behind the glass, watching him. She'd pulled herself up just to see, hands gripping the sill like she needed to feel his rhythm. When he came back inside, snow crusted on his boots, she was still there. He dropped the armful of logs and hung his coat. She didn't turn away, just said softly, "You work like it's the only thing keeping you standing." He looked at her, taken off guard by the accuracy. "Work keeps a man alive out here," he said. "And alone," she added, her voice barely above the fire's crackle. He didn't answer. But the words stayed with him. Later, when he brought her beans and bread, she finally asked the question he'd known was coming since the night he carried her in. "What happens when I can walk?" She didn't ask it with fear, more like challenge. He met her eyes without blinking. "That's your choice," he said. "If you want to go, I won't stop you. If you want to stay, then stay." She stared at him for a long, heavy moment, measuring, then said nothing, just turned back to her food. But the question had been asked. The answer had been given. That evening she asked to sit by the fire instead of the bed. He hesitated, then helped her. She leaned against him as he helped her across the few feet. Her body was warm beneath the quilt. He lowered her into the chair, and she stretched her hands out toward the flames. For a time they sat in silence, the fire doing all the talking. Then, as he leaned forward to mend one of his traps, she asked quietly, "Do you hate them? My people?" His hands froze over the wire. He thought of the war, of the men he'd fought beside, of the curses thrown at Apache names, raids, killings, land disputes. He thought of Jesse, not killed in battle, just fever. He laid the wire down and looked straight at her. "No," he said. "I hate what men become when they stop seeing each other as human. That's what I hate." Her shoulders eased slightly. She turned her gaze back to the fire. "Then you're not like most," she whispered. He didn't speak, but her words settled into his chest like coals that refused to go cold. When the night dragged on and weariness crept in, he lifted her gently, carrying her to the bed. She didn't resist. Her head rested against his chest, and for the first time, her body softened in his arms. As Elias tucked the quilt around her, she murmured, "Thank you." He lingered watching as sleep stole over her features. Outside, the skies had cleared, but inside the cabin, a different kind of storm had begun to stir. Questions lingered. Could trust grow here? Would she stay when her strength returned, or vanish the moment she could stand? He had no answers yet, but for the first time in years he found himself wondering, maybe even hoping. Snow blanketed the valley in heavy silence. Where sunlight touched the crust shone, but beneath the pines drifts piled high. Days had slipped by since the storm. And though they had enough dried beans to last a bit, Elias knew it couldn't go on much longer. Rhea's leg, while mending, needed fresh bandages and salve, and she needed more than what his sparse shelves held. He'd stayed away from town for longer than most would think possible, but now the choice was staring him down. That morning, he dragged the sled to the door, lined it with a thick quilt, and placed a hot stone beside the stove to keep her feet warm. Rhea narrowed her eyes when she saw him packing it. "You're taking me to town?" she asked, suspicion in her voice. He met her gaze evenly. "You need a doctor to check that leg. And I need coffee. Salt. Flour. Won't be gone long." Her fingers gripped the quilt around her shoulders. "What'll they say when they see me with you?" He paused. Truth was, he didn't know. After the war, townsfolk had gone colder, eyes sharper toward any Apache face. But he wouldn't let her see that. "Doesn't matter what they say," he said firmly. "You're with me." Something in those words quieted her. She gave a slow nod and let him lift her into the sled. She winced when her injured leg shifted but bit back the pain. He wrapped her up tight and tucked the hot stone near her boots. With reins in hand, he coaxed the mule forward, the sled groaning over frozen ruts. The ride was slow. Pines flanked the trail, their limbs sagging with snow. Rhea watched the woods pass by her face, pale but focused. Elias caught glimpses of her hands clenched in her lap, and how she stiffened at the sound of ice cracking down by the creek. She didn't fear pain, he'd already learned that, but people stirred something deeper in her. When they rolled into town, smoke coiled from chimneys and hammering echoed from the sawmill. The mercantile's windows were glazed with frost lanterns glowing inside. Elias pulled the mule to a stop and climbed down. Two men by the stove inside turned toward the window. Their faces shifted when they saw Rhea on the sled. Elias felt their stares but gave them nothing. He stepped inside. The bell jingled. Behind the counter stood Amos Tate, a burly man with a graying beard. He squinted, then nodded. "Well, I'll be. Thought the mountain swallowed you whole." "Still breathing," Elias replied dryly. "Need flour, coffee, and bandages if you got any." Amos began scooping from burlap sacks. The two men by the stove muttered under their breath, throwing sideways glances toward the sled. One let out a chuckle low, but loud enough. Elias turned gaze hard as stone. They looked away. When he returned with the bundle of supplies, he found Rhea sitting straight, her back stiff, chin lifted. She'd seen the stairs, but gave them nothing. He handed her the canteen before guiding the mule toward Doc Virgil's office. The doctor, a wiry man with spectacles, inspected her wound. "Stitches are clean. Healing better than most would in this weather," he said. "Change 'em daily, keep her warm. She'll walk again given time." He handed Elias a tin of salve and folded cloth without asking a single question. No judgment in his voice. Elias was quietly grateful. Outside, Rhea pulled the quilt tighter. Then, her voice low, she said, "They look at me like I'm less than dirt." Elias gripped the reins, jaw tense. "Let 'em look. They don't get to decide who you are." She studied him, something softer behind her eyes. "And you? Why take the risk being seen with me?" He didn't look away from the trail. "Because you're not nothing. You're here. That's what matters." The way back was quieter, but not cold. Not like before. Rhea leaned into the quilt, her face turned toward him, as if weighing every word. When the cabin came into view, she exhaled slow, like some tight string had finally loosened. Inside, Elias unloaded the supplies. She eased back onto the bed, watching him. A faint smile tugged at her lips. "You didn't lie," she said. "You kept me safe." He met her eyes. "Told you you're with me. That doesn't change." The fire cracked and popped in the stove. For the first time since that day at the creek, she didn't feel like some lost soul inside his home. She felt like someone who might have a place there. The days after the ride into town settled into a new kind of rhythm, different from before, but familiar in its own way. Elias felt it most each morning as the light spilled through the window. The shelves weren't bare anymore, flour in a fresh sack, beans stacked up, coffee, and even a jar of amber honey that glinted gold whenever the stove door cracked open. Doc Virgil's bandages and salves sat neat in a tin by the table, ready each evening when Elias cleaned and redressed Ria's wound. Her leg still mended slower than either of them liked, but strong enough now that she could sit near the fire instead of being stuck in bed. She'd started testing herself, just small efforts, at first reaching for the broom, folding her own blanket, pouring water into the basin. Elias had tried to stop her the first time, told her to take it easy, but she'd met him with a stare that froze him in place. "I ain't here to be useless," she said flat. He didn't argue after that. That night, while he sat at the table mending a worn harness strap, she spoke up. "You built this place." He gave a quiet nod, his eyes still on the leather. "After the war. Took me near a year. Traded hours at the sawmill for lumber. Hauled the stone myself." "Alone?" she asked. "Always?" There was no pity in her face, just something quiet and knowing. Wrapped in a quilt, she shifted in her chair and said, "It shows, solid. But you didn't build it for more than one." The words landed harder than he expected. He'd never thought of the place like that before. It had just been shelter. Nothing more. But now, with her in it, he saw the truth of what she meant. The next morning, she insisted on helping with breakfast. Her leg trembled when she stood leaning into his arms, but she didn't let it show. She stirred the pot of cornmeal, cracked their last egg into it, then handed him a spoon with a firm look that warned him not to stop her. They ate side by side at the table. Not many words passed, but the silence was easy now, steady grounding. It made the place feel less hollow. Later, after Elias returned from checking the snares, he found her sewing. She'd taken one of his old shirts from the wall peg, the collar frayed, and was stitching it back with the needle he'd left on the table. She barely glanced up, then returned to her work. He stood there watching her hands move swift and sure. Something shifted inside him, something he hadn't dared to feel in years. That evening, as dusk settled and the fire snapped and hissed, her leg ached deep. She pressed her lips tight, refusing to make a sound, but Elias saw it. He scooted closer, gently, laying his hand over hers on the chair's edge. She didn't flinch. Instead, she turned her hand up and laced her fingers with his. The firelight softened her face, smoothing out the harsh lines hunger and pain had carved. Her eyes met his, clear, steady. "You kept me safe in town," she said softly. "You keep me safe here." "Why?" His chest tightened. He didn't have a practiced answer. "Because you deserve that," he murmured. "Because no one else ever did." They stayed like that, unmoving. Then she leaned her head against his shoulder. The weight was light, but what it meant was not. He didn't move. He let her stay, her breath warm against him, mingling with the pop of the fire. That night, when he carried her back to bed, she didn't stiffen. Her arm draped around his neck. Her body rested easy in his hold. Her eyes met his without fear. As he settled her beneath the quilt, she whispered, "I don't feel like nothing anymore." He paused, hand at her shoulder, throat tight. "You never were," he told her. She closed her eyes then. Sleep came quiet. Elias stood for a while, listening to the wind and the low hum of the stove. For the first time since he built the place, the cabin didn't feel like a shelter meant to keep the world out. It felt like the start of something real, something that could last. Each morning the light pushed through the pines a little sooner, dripping snow melt from the roof, carving tiny rivers in the thawing ground. The earth softened under Elias's boots as he stepped out to chop wood, and the air no longer smelled of frost, but of damp soil. The change wasn't just in the land, it was inside the cabin too. Ria's leg was growing stronger. The stitches had held. Her skin was healing smooth. She still limped, but each day the steps came easier. She pushed herself first, making it from bed to chair, then from chair to table, with just a hand on the wall. Elias stayed near, ready to catch her. But when he lingered too close, she waved him off. "I need to feel it for myself," she told him. He understood. One morning she asked him for a spade. He raised a brow. "What for?" She pointed to a patch of earth near the porch where snow had receded. "That dirt's soft now. I can plant beans. If I start soon, they'll catch." He hesitated. Part of him wanted to say no to tell her to rest, but the other part, the one that watched her sit by the fire, fold blankets, mend his shirts, recognized something deeper. She wasn't offering help. She was claiming a place here. He gave her the spade. From the window, he watched her kneel in the soil, her dark hair spilling as she worked the earth with patient hands. Her limp was there, yes, but her movements were steady. For the first time since he found her in that snare, she didn't look like someone trying to survive. She looked like someone preparing for a future. That night over bread and beans, she spoke the question that had lingered ever since he carried her from the creek. "Do you want me here, Elias?" He froze spoon mid-air, met her gaze across the table, the firelight catching gold in her eyes. "If I didn't," he said slowly, "you wouldn't be." "That's not the same," she said. "You could have left me after I healed. Could have sent me away. But you didn't." Elias set the spoon aside, jaw tight, as he swallowed hard. His voice came low, unpolished. "I don't want you gone. Not anymore." Ria parted her lips, hesitated, then reached across the table, her fingers resting gently over his. "Then I'll stay." The stillness that followed wasn't awkward or unsure. It was quiet agreement, settled certain. Later, while she stitched the last frayed shirt sleeve, Elias sat carving a piece of juniper. His hands worked slow, shaping the wood into a smooth circle. No flourishes, just something honest and strong. When he finished, he placed the ring between them on the table. She looked at it, then up at him. He didn't speak. No long words, no question asked, only his eyes. Ria picked up the ring, turned it over once in her fingers, then slipped it on. It was loose, but it held. Her eyes stayed steady on his. "Yes," she said. That night she didn't wait for him to lift her. She stood on her own, limping but sure, and reached for his hand. He followed her to the bed, his chest heavy with something he hadn't let himself feel in years. When they lay beneath the quilt, firelight flickering across the walls, there was no doubt left between them. She touched his cheek, tracing the old scar at his jaw, and kissed him slow and soft, but full of everything words couldn't hold. For the first time since the war, Elias allowed himself to believe in something more than just getting by. And for the first time since that cruel steel trap, Ria let herself believe she was more than just a body spared. The wind outside still howled, but inside something real had begun to take root. Spring crept in slow settling across the valley with steady hands. The creek ran louder now, snowmelt rushing fast over the stones. The scent of pine and damp soil drifted through the cabin's cracks. Elias's old cabin didn't stand against the cold anymore. It welcomed warmth, held it. Inside, the rhythm shifted. Rhea moved through the rooms on her own, walking with a limp but moving with purpose. She tended her bean sprouts, folded clean clothes, stirred the pot on the stove like she'd always belonged there. Her hands, once weak and trembling, worked now with quiet confidence. Elias noticed most in the mornings. He'd wake to the sound of her light footsteps, a clink of cups, the scent of coffee. For years, all he'd heard at dawn was wind groaning through the beams. Now he listened for her before he even breathed. One night they sat by the fire. Rhea turned the ring on her finger, studying its worn grain. "This ain't enough," she said softly. He blinked. "What do you mean if I'm staying?" she said, voice steady. "It's got to be more than a ring. It needs to be said out loud, written down. Not for us, for folks who'll say I don't belong." Elias thought of the sidelong looks back in town, the muttered words, the judgment. She was right. The woods and a carved band might hold them together in private, but out there, it wouldn't be enough. And even if he didn't give a damn what others thought of him, he sure as hell cared what they might do or say about her. The next day they hitched the mule and rode into town. The thaw made the trail a mess, mud slick under the sled. Rhea sat tall, wrapped tight in her shawl, chin high. When Elias helped her down, her limp showed, but her steps were firm. The justice's office stood plain beside the old mill, just a room of ledgers and dust. The man behind the desk raised his brows as they stepped in, but said nothing. Elias laid down a few coins. His voice didn't waver. "We're here to marry." The vows were simple, no pomp. Elias's voice held the weight of years, but never once cracked. Rhea's voice rang steady and strong, no doubt in it. When the justice asked for witnesses, Amos Tate from the store stepped in, and Silas Kane from the mill nodded and signed beside him. The ring she wore was humble, carved by hand. But when she slid it back on, it felt real, like a promise made in both wood and words. They stepped out into the sunlight, just a sliver through parting clouds, but enough to warm the porch and the shawl around her shoulders. Elias looked at her, then, not as someone he'd rescued, not someone hidden away in the shadows of his past, but as his wife. She met his gaze with the barest smile. Small, steady, like it had been her choice all along. The ride back home felt different. The mud didn't slow them. The wind couldn't reach them. And when the cabin came into view, crouched on its familiar slope, Rhea reached for his hand. "It don't look like a place made for one anymore," she said. Inside they shared stew and bread with honey. Talked about little things, when to plant the next row, whether they ought to trade for a goat, how to fix the roof before summer storms. Simple talk, but the kind neither of them took lightly. That night she led him to the bed. No hesitation. The firelight danced low, casting soft shadows. Their bodies met in quiet reverence, nothing rushed, nothing taken, just shared. Each touch was offered, each breath answered. It wasn't the desperate grasp of strangers. It was two souls choosing each other again and again. When morning came, the world was still the same, the pines, the creek, the roof beams groaning. But something deep had changed. The silence no longer felt hollow. It felt like home. Elias stood in the doorway, Rhea resting against him, her body healing, her presence anchoring. She looked out at the land, then up at him. "This is home now." He nodded. One word wasn't needed. For the first time in years, he wasn't just surviving. He had a life again. And she was the reason. No questions, no doubts. They had chosen, and they would stay. If this story has touched your heart, I invite you to stay with us to discover more true tales of the Wild West. Stories that honor resilience, tenderness, and the spirit that God placed in those who blazed the trail. Subscribe, share, leave your thoughts in the comments, and join us once again to journey across this untamed land. Thank you